Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show. It's the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible, and then helps you to better explain your faith with both courage and compassion. If we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also a professor of Bible and theology at the Moody Bible Institute, and I want to welcome you to my independent show. Well, one of the tough questions we get oftentimes about the Bible is this question about contradictions in the Bible, specifically talking about the stories about Jesus in the Gospels. Are the Gospels really full of contradictions? And why do the Gospels tell stories differently, the same story differently? My guest on the show today is Dr. Mike Licona. Mike is a professor of New Testament at Houston Christian University and the president of Risen Jesus, and he's also the author of this book, Jesus Contradicted: Why the Gospels Tell the Same Story Differently. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, thanks, Mikel. It's great to see you again, my brother.
Yeah, I'm glad that we finally made this happen. Tell us how this book came about. Why did you write this book, and who'd you write it for?
Well, several years ago, 2008 and 2009, I debated Bart Ehrman on the resurrection of Jesus. And during those debates, one of Ehrman's primary objections was that the Gospels disagree with so many things. They contradict one another on so many details. And I answered that by saying, look, I haven't even built my case for the resurrection based on the reliability of the Gospels. And in fact, all the facts that I'm using to build my case, Bart, you even agree with them. So where we disagree is on method and the conclusion. That's where we have to focus. And I kept bringing it back to that. And although a lot of people thought that I won that debate, they told me that their faith was rocked because I didn't address the matter of the attacks that he was giving on the Gospels, such as authorship, bias, contradictions, how long they were written after the events they purport to describe, etc. So I thought, what I will do is I will do deep dives into these issues and respond to those for the sake of the Christians who are really struggling with these things when they hear them from skeptics like Ehrman. So I spent 8 years on a focused study, focused research on differences in the Gospels. And you had people like Richard Burridge and others who were saying the Gospels are ancient biographies. And because they are, ancient biography worked a little differently than modern biography. And there was a flexibility, you could say elasticity, in the way that they reported various historical details. Their objectives for precision were not the same as ours are today. They wanted it to be accurate overall in the portrait. That was more important to them in illuminating the main character's character than it was to report with precise accuracy. So I thought, okay, well, let me start studying and really paying attention to these ancient biographies and see if that will cast light on how we view the Gospels. So I made a list of all the biographies that have survived that were written about anybody, but they were written within 150 years on each side of Jesus. And there are about 90 of them. The guy that wrote the most is Plutarch, and he wrote more than 60, of which 48 have survived. Well, as I read through those, and as I got toward the end, I recognized that 9 of them involved people who lived at the same time, and many of them knew one another and participated in the same events. So I thought, whoa, so Plutarch is going to tell the same story in multiple of these lives. Biographies were called lives back then. So I read through them a second time and made a list of all the stories, or as we would say, pericopes. And then I made this catalog, and then I focused on 9 of these lives where it's a transition from the Roman Republic to Empire, and that's where most of these occur. And so I cataloged it. I read through a third time of these 9, and it was just so enlightening. I was able to find 36 stories that appear in 2 or more of these lives. And then when I'm going through them with a fine-tooth comb, of the 36, 30 of them, they have differences. And then as you look at those differences carefully, they form a pattern of the kind of differences. And then as I started to read what classicists, specialists in Plutarch were saying, they identified what they called compositional devices. that Plutarch, and they said every historian and biographer used, that would have resulted in these differences. And Plutarch never copies and pastes. He varies the accounts by using these compositional devices. So I thought, this is fascinating. So what if we read the Gospels in view of these and look at the differences? Would that shed light? So I read through the Gospels 8 times. I think it was 8 times. It might have been 9, but I think it was 8 times in Greek. And I made a catalog of all the differences between them that I saw. It was over 50 pages worth. And then I started to read those differences in view of the compositional devices that were identified by classicists, and it just sheds so much light. So I published a book by Oxford University Press, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, back in 2017. It's an academic monograph. It's primarily written for scholars and graduate students of the classics and New Testament studies. There were a number of people, as I lectured around the world on this, they were saying, this is really fascinating, but can you do something to put the hay down where the sheep can eat it, And so after getting a number of those requests, I started to write the new book, the book that you just mentioned, Jesus Contradicted, Why the Gospels Tell the Same Story Differently. And during that time, a lot of Christians were asking questions for clarification. And so I deal with this. How does this work with the doctrine of inspiration? How does it work with inerrancy? Plus, I'm thinking, I'm seeing new examples that I can use, and I can, explain things like the synoptic problem and how this relates to what I'm doing here. So that is what led me another 3 years to write this book.
Wow. Well, okay, we've covered a lot of material already, so let's just go back to some of the things that you mentioned. You talked about ancient biographies versus modern day biographies. And for some people who approach the Gospels and they're not entirely sure the kind of genre that they're reading, we could approach the Gospels with the wrong kind of expectation and hold the Gospels to a standard that is a 21st century standard and not the way they were working and not their interests and their concerns. It's kind of like a chronological snobbery to say, well, if you didn't do it the way that we would do it in 21st century America, then you're just wrong, right? But how does understanding this idea of the portrait, the idea of what makes a person great versus the modern day biography, how does that help us in taking a look at some of these differences?
Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great in chapter 1 is the most read, the most recognized passage in all of Plutarch's literature. By the way, back then, or right even now, they call the main character the biography, not ending with a Y, but an EE. What Plutarch says is, look, when creating a portrait, painting a portrait of an individual, the painter, the artist, focuses on the eyes because the eyes show the character of the biography, EE, okay? Said, look, because this is a biography, you're going to have to be patient and don't get on me if I don't mention a number of fantastic events in this person's life, like battles where thousands fall that they commanded. What Plutarch says he's going to focus on are the words and deeds of the person that illuminate their character, the kind of person they were. And it's usually done not only for educational purposes, but for ethical, moral purposes, because they want the person to either emulate those character qualities or to avoid them. So that's the purpose of an ancient biography, where a lot of people, Christians and skeptics, get things confused, is they, like the Christians, will think, well, since the Gospels are divinely inspired, well, they've got to be practically transcripts almost, a reporting of what actually happened. They're going to have to be very accurate because that's what divinely inspired scripture. God was behind this. But, God was behind the psalmist as well. And yet you have the psalmist talk about God sleeping. Well, we don't think God sleeps, of course, right? That's poetry. Or in Proverbs, when it says the woman named Wisdom stands on top of the roof, and yells down to simpletons and invite them to come and to learn from her. Well, of course, that's not talking about a literal woman doing that. That's the personification. It's wisdom literature. It's a rhetorical device. Parables aren't meant to be understood as history, right? They are there to communicate the principle that's behind it, and to interpret them as history would be wrong, going down the wrong road. Well, in ancient biography, they wanted to report actual historical events, but the main objective was to report them in such a way as to illuminate the person's main character. So that's why they could bend the details a little bit, stuff that we even do today. So in Mark chapter 1, verse 5, Mark says that the entire region of Judea and every Jerusalemite came out to see John the Baptist, and they were baptized by him. Well, of course, we can't take that literally, because that would mean that every member of the Sanhedrin, including the high priest, went out to see John the Baptist and was baptized by him. And that's not what Mark is saying there. Of course, he's using hyperbole. The fact was that many were coming from the region of Judea, and many Jerusalemites were coming out to see John the Baptist, and many of those were being baptized. But to say all of them were, that is hyperbole. It's an exaggeration for effect. We don't think of that as an error, but it's to communicate the essence of what had happened more than the actual factual reporting would. And so they would do this also with things that would illuminate the character of the person.
Yeah, so if you went to a party today and you told your friend, yeah, you should have been there. Everyone was there, man. But okay, maybe not literally every single person you know in the whole school was there, but there were a lot of people there, right? And
That's a good example.
I think we need to appreciate what God's given us in Scripture and understand how He's given it to us and how the Gospels are working, so that we don't see errors where there aren't errors just because we're not putting ourselves in the shoes of someone in the first century writing. And before we actually get into some of the more detailed discussion on this, talk about how your work in historical Jesus studies in terms of the resurrection. That's actually how I found out about your work, is through your work with Gary Habermas on the case for the resurrection of Jesus, that book you did with Gary. How does understanding our questions and even our doubts about the Bible, how can the resurrection frame that for a Christian who's investigating this?
Well, first, I looked at the resurrection of Jesus, and especially later on when I did my doctoral research, I wanted to approach it as a historian would. If you subject the data and the text to critical historical review, what would an critical historical investigation of the resurrection look like without assuming scriptures are even reliable? And I was just amazed at how strong the historical evidence is through using strictly controlled historical method, how strong the evidence is for the resurrection of Jesus. So once I came to the conclusion that, certainly Jesus rose from the dead, a lot of the other things, they fall into place. If Jesus rose, Christianity's true. And so we would want to know more about Jesus at this point and what he said. And so then you come looking at the Gospels critically as a critical historian and say, well, what can we actually prove apart from faith? And it seems that through multiple independent sources and motifs that permeate throughout the Gospels, we see that Jesus had a very high view of Scripture. That is, he believed at minimum that it derived from God in some sense and that it's authoritative. All right. So of course, that's referring to the Old Testament. If Jesus thought the Old Testament was divinely inspired, it derived from God in some sense and is authoritative, well, then I should think that as well, right? At minimum, that's what I should think. Then we can see through historical research that Jesus commissioned his disciples and gave them authority. Now, of course, a skeptical historian will say, yeah, he commissioned his disciples and gave them authority because he thought he had authority, but he actually didn't. He was just a human, and so their authority was just perceived. Oh, if that's what you want to say, you can. But if Jesus actually rose from the dead, then he has that authority. He gives that authority to the disciples. And then to the extent that the New Testament literature preserves the teachings of Jesus and his apostles, we can say that that literature, at least at minimum, at some sense, it derives from God and is authoritative. So now the scriptures become something that is very important as our guide for life. And so, that's how historical investigation, I think, impacts my study of the Gospels, in terms of how I'm going to view them.
Yeah, and so for Christians who maybe have a question about this or that, and they maybe even come to a faith crisis, I love how you remind us that if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, and that's just the end of it. And so you can don't let these text critical problems or historical problems that we don't have final answers on or philosophical certainty. You don't have to wait till you have all your questions answered to trust Jesus or to be faithful and loyal to him, even while you work through some of these things. And your views may change on some of these things, but it's okay for Christians to have doubts and questions about these things and work through them while staying faithful to Jesus. And I love your new historiographical approach, the larger book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach. That's a book that I really, I took as kind of a template for my doctoral dissertation. And thank you for being on my dissertation committee. It was so cool to have you as part of that as I was working through the minimal facts approach that you talk about in that book.
Well, you did good work, Mikkel.
Oh, well, thank you so much. By the way, there is a book coming out next year, Lord willing, 2025, that I have with IVP Academic on that. And the title is, Did Jesus Really Say He Was God? And so that's kind of like you did, making a more popular version versus just publishing a very academic kind of dissertation kind of thing. So I hope that people will check that out as well.
That'd be a good book because your dissertation was excellent, and IVP Academic. Wow. I published my big book on the resurrection through them, and they were just such a delight to work with. I mean, they were amazing.
I'm finding that as well. And actually, the reason I approached them is because they published your historiographical approach. And I thought, this might be a good place for my book to land, and they might appreciate what I'm doing here in this book. But getting back to this idea of differences in the Gospels, you talk about compositional devices, and you already mentioned one example. But let's talk about two key principles that you have in the book, and then let's work through some case studies so that we can see these compositional devices in action. Okay, so tell us the two principles that we need to keep in mind as we begin to work through these texts.
So the first principle is that our view of Scripture should be consistent with what we observe in Scripture. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't have a view of Scripture that when we read Scripture, it doesn't seem to line up with that, right? The second principle is, if we truly desire to have a high view of Scripture, then we must accept it as God has given it to us, rather than trying to force it to fit in a mold of how we think he should have. Mm-hmm. And if we neglect in doing this, we may truly believe we have a high view of Scripture, when in reality, we have a high view of our view of Scripture. Yeah. So something that could be a parallel thing would be a high view of God. So let's say a person says, a universalist says, well, my view of God is higher. My view of God as a universalist is higher than your view of God as an exclusivist, because you're, as an exclusivist, are saying Jesus is the only way and there's no way to heaven except through him, through accepting the gospel. And I, as a universalist, think that everybody is going to heaven due to God's profound love for his creation. And so I, the universalist, have a higher view of God than you do. Well, I would respond as that to that and say, no, you don't have a higher view of God. You have an incorrect view of God, because the highest view of God is going to be the correct view of God. Or you could say that in reverse. The correct view of God is the highest view of God. Mm-hmm. And so in a similar way, the correct view of Scripture is the highest view of Scripture. Mm-hmm. And so if you are trying to hold on to a view of Scripture that's not in concert with the reality of what Scripture is, you don't have a high view of Scripture. You have a high view of your view of Scripture. So
Yeah.
those are the two principles.
Yeah. Sometimes people try to contort the Bible to fit their own personal view of what the Bible actually is trying to do when it's not really trying to do that. So you talk in the book about the very words of Jesus, for example, and the voice of Jesus. This idea of some people think, on one hand, you have like a live stream version of exactly what happened, that you had a voice recorder going, you're recording Jesus' Sermon on the Mount on the exact words coming out of his mouth. And then probably on the other side is this radical skepticism where we have no idea what Jesus said, right? And we need to avoid that radical skepticism, but also not be naive about how the words coming out, the sounds coming out of Jesus' mouth are not the Greek words that we have in the Bible. In fact, we have, I think, maybe the very words of Jesus in a limited sense, where he says things like Talitha Kum, from the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, things that are in Aramaic preserved even in the Greek. Okay, but most of the time, we're not getting the sounds that are coming out of Jesus' mouth. We're getting the voice, the message, the teaching of Jesus. And some people are uncomfortable with that, but I think we need to not put our ideas of what should be there on the text and then say, oh, well, if it's not that way, then it's not right,
I agree with you, Mikkel. One time I had an attorney came up to me after lecturing, and he says, it just makes me a little uncomfortable what you said, because as an attorney, I want to view the Gospels as reporting what Jesus said and did, as though, with the accuracy of a transcript of a legal deposition. I said, sure, we'd all like that, but that wasn't the objective of the Gospel authors. That's not even the objective of modern biographers and historians. So you got to look at the difference in genre here. So you're right. Jesus primarily spoke in Aramaic, maybe in Hebrew, probably in Hebrew at times, but primarily in Aramaic. And sometimes he spoke in Greek, I'm sure. He was probably quite proficient in Greek, as Greek was a 1/3 of all the 1/3 or even more, up to 40% of all the inscriptions that have been found in Jerusalem, in the most Jewish of all the cities of Judea, are in Greek. So Jesus was probably fairly conversant in Greek. But that said, we're usually getting a Greek translation of the original Aramaic as it was remembered, years later. Now that said, as these disciples heard Jesus preach the same kind of stuff over and over and over and over and over. So it's like I've heard so many different debates of William Lane Craig that I can repeat a lot of his arguments verbatim, and even with the same voice inflection that he uses at the time. And I'm sure that the disciples got to a point where they could say a whole lot of the same stuff that Jesus said. And then for decades, they're repeating the same stuff hundreds of times. So the stuff we're reading in the Gospels is most likely a very accurate translation and close to the words of Jesus translated, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it's still not precise. But then you go to John, and it's very different. And there you're hearing more of what you called the ipsissima vox, the voice of Jesus. It's communicating more of the message than the actual words. As Paul Anderson, one of the foremost, perhaps the foremost Johannine specialist in the world today, he once said to me that what we are reading in John is a theological paraphrase of Jesus. That John has taken Jesus' words and recast them as his own, in his own idiom. Or as F.F. Bruce said, that John takes the Jesus tradition and recast it as an expanded paraphrase, a translation of the freest kind, a transposition into another key, and so much more. But it preserves the message of Jesus. And it makes it, at least I appreciate John, because it takes some of the things Jesus said and makes it clear for this 21st century Westerner.
Well, let's take a look at some of these compositional devices, and let's just take a look at a couple case studies. First, let's go to Jesus' baptism. This is one that sometimes people bring up and say, why are there differences in the way that we see it in Mark and the way we see it in Matthew? So when in Mark, the earliest gospel, we have the voice from heaven, God saying, "You are my beloved son." And then, of course, Luke follows that in Luke 3. But then in Matthew 3, we have, "This is my beloved son." And that makes some people uncomfortable. They're not entirely sure why they're different there. How would you help somebody work through that question?
Yeah, well, first I'd point out that the vast majority of New Testament scholars, including evangelicals, think that Mark wrote first and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their primary source. Moreover, Matthew was not there. He and Luke wasn't. They both came along later. And so if they're using Mark as their primary source and supplementing it, where Matthew or Luke diverge from Mark in many, no, not all cases, but in many cases, Matthew and Luke would be doing the editing for some kind of a reason. They're editing Mark. So you're right, Mark and Luke have the voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved," or "You are my beloved son. With you I'm well pleased." God's voice is addressing Jesus directly. Whereas in Matthew, "This is my beloved son. With him I am well pleased." God's voice is addressing the crowd directly. Now, I've heard some evangelical scholars try to reconcile this and say, well, God said both. Well, congratulations. You've just agreed with the Gospel of the Ebionites written in the 2nd century, because they were trying to do the same thing. I think Augustine was probably correct, though, when he says that Matthew changed what Mark had written so that God's voice would address the crowd, because he wants to make it more personable to the readers of Matthew's gospel, who are, in essence, the onlookers at this point in the narrative. And to me, that makes a whole lot more sense. And we see Matthew making adjustments like this throughout his gospel. It's one of the patterns that you identify in Matthew as you really look at this stuff more carefully.
And I think what is most significant, well, it's certainly significant to Jesus if he hears God say, "You are my beloved son," but it's significant to other people that Jesus is God's beloved son. And so I think that's the emphasis there of what we're trying to get across, is the idea that Jesus is God's son. And so you call this transferal in the book. Is there an example in Plutarch that led you to say, hey, this is kind of like what I see in Plutarch and the way people used to write back in the day?
Yeah, there's plenty of examples in Plutarch. One that comes to mind that I really like involves the Roman general Pompey. In 52 BC, I think it's around February, the Roman Senate says, we are in desperate times now. We have to make a desperate move. We have a president here in the United States. The Roman Republic had what was called a consul. That was the main figure. And there were 2 consuls who served simultaneously. So what they determined is that Pompey would be the sole consul for the year of 52 BC, and he could do whatever he wanted. He had to clean up the nation, get things back in order, and he did not need Senate approval. So Pompey made a number of laws, some good laws, and he got things back in order. One law was that if a guy is on trial, his friends can't come in and read a speech of lavish praise called an encomium, because it would unduly bias the jury by giving them information that's really irrelevant to whether the person committed the crime. Well, then Pompey's friend, Plancus, went on trial in later 52 BC. And then by the time you get to early 51 BC, Pompey is no longer consul. He's out with his armies in his consular province, and he sees that things aren't going well for Plancus. And so what he does is he writes an encomium and has it read before the trial in order to bias the jury. and breaks the same law that he had established on the previous year. Well, this is reported by Plutarch twice. Other historians report it as well. In his Life of Cato the Younger, Plutarch reports that Pompey wrote this encomium and sent it in via an emissary who read it at the trial. But and we know from other historians that this is the way it happened. But according to Plutarch's Life of Pompey, he transfers the action of reading it before the jury to Pompey, and just has Pompey go into the city and read it at the trial. Again, we know from other historians it didn't happen this way. We also know that a general could not come in once he had an army outside the city. He was not allowed back into the city. So it would have happened that he would have sent an emissary, but Plutarch's Life of Pompey simplifies it and just has Pompey come in and read it, transfers the action of reading it to Pompey himself. So it's an essentially faithful representation of what occurred, but it's not precise in its accuracy. We find something similar, Mikkel, in Jesus healing the centurion's servant, and that is reported in Matthew and in Luke. So in Luke, Jesus sends Jewish elder. The centurion sends Jewish elders out to Jesus to request that he would come and heal the servant. Jesus agrees to do so. And then the centurion gets wind that Jesus is on his way. He's got a change of mind, and he sends some Jewish friends out that say, look, the centurion says he's not worthy for you to come under his roof. So, you're a man of authority. Just say the word and his servant will be healed. And Jesus praises the centurion and heals the servant without ever seeing the centurion or the servant. But Matthew, here we go again with Matthew. He simplifies it and he transfers the action of going to Jesus to the centurion, who goes directly to Jesus and makes the plea. And Jesus says, let's go. And the centurion says, no, I'm unworthy. You're a man of authority. Just say the word, my servant will be healed. And Jesus heals him. So yeah, that's one for transferal.
Yeah, that's one that I love to talk about as well. If you hear on the news that the president said today, and then you cut to the video and it's the press secretary talking, it's as good as if the president said it, right? And so I don't think these authors are doing things that are malicious or trying to trick us, but we can sometimes think that because we don't understand the way that they used to write back in the day. And so I think it's cool how not only the historical background, these New Testament backgrounds kinds of things in terms of history is helpful, but even reading literature from people like Plutarch to understand how we see what you call compositional devices working as a normal kind of way that people would write these kind of biographies back in the day. Let's go to this one on surrounding the resurrection, is this idea about how many women were at the tomb. This is one that I hear a lot from skeptics who want to say that there's contradictions all over. And what they point out is that in John 20, we have Mary Magdalene mentioned at the tomb of Jesus. And then in Matthew 28, we have Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And then in Mark 16, we have Mary Magdalene and the mother of James and Salome. And then in Mark 24:10, it's Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and also the other women with them. And so people will say, how many women were at the tomb? And as Ehrman likes to say, it depends which gospel you read, as if to say, giving the impression perhaps that the gospel writers are just making up this story. How do you help a Christian work through that kind of question? What's the compositional device that can help us make sense of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's an easy one, though. So as I'm studying through Plutarch, the compositional device that I see it occurring more than any other is something we call literary spotlighting. So imagine that you're at a theatrical performance, and there are a number of actors on the stage, carrying out the performance, and all of a sudden the lights go out and a spotlight comes on and shines on one of the actors on the stage who breaks out in a monologue. Well, other actors are on the stage at that point, but you don't see them any longer because the focus is on that single character. That's shining the spotlight on that character, for focus. Literary spotlighting is when an author knows that other people are involved, but only mentions a single character. And I saw this more than any other compositional device that Plutarch used. So take this. So if that's the case, we shouldn't be surprised if we don't see this in the Gospels. And if this is a common compositional device, we should be surprised if we don't see it. Okay, so let's go to the resurrection narratives, because I'm going to show you not only spotlighting there with the women, it's there with some other things as well in the resurrection narrative. So you're right, Sunday morning, you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, all report that multiple women went to the tomb, whereas John reports Mary Magdalene going to the tomb. So is there a contradiction there? No, because the very next verse in John chapter 20, after it's saying, early in the morning while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and found it empty. The next verse says, so she ran and found Peter and the beloved disciple and says to them, they have taken the Lord and we don't know where they've laid him. Who's we, right? Who's we? Well, it's probably not Mary, Peter, and the beloved disciple, because of course, before Mary just showed up a moment ago, they didn't even know the tomb was empty. So she's probably referring to the other women involved. According to Luke, Peter gets up and runs to the tomb and finds it as the women had said, whereas in John's gospel, it says Peter and the beloved disciple ran to the tomb. So which is it? Just Peter or Peter and the beloved disciple? Well, Luke doesn't say just Peter. He only mentions Peter, though. But he's aware of the others. How do we know this? Because he mentions Peter running to the tomb in chapter 24, verse 12. But when you go down 12 verses more, chapter 24, verse 24, Jesus is talking to the Emmaus disciples. It says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And so he says, why the long faces, guys? And they say, are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened here? And Jesus says, tell me. And so they said, well, Jesus, this guy Jesus, we thought he was a prophet, the Messiah, but he was crucified on Friday. Some of our women folk went to the tomb and found it empty, and some angels were there, they reported, that said he'd been raised from the dead. And then some of our own, plural, some of our own went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Well, wait a minute, Luke. Just 12 verses earlier, you said just Peter went to the tomb. No, I didn't say just Peter. I only mentioned Peter because I'm shining my literary spotlight on him. He's the lead apostle. Might even have been the source from which he got the story. And that's why he's shining the spotlight. We don't know, but he's obviously using literary spotlighting here. And then when these women went to the tomb, how many angels did they see? Matthew and Mark report 1, Luke and John report 2. Well, I think it's very likely that what's happening here is, as Mark, followed by Matthew, are reporting the angel who is doing the speaking, the announcing at the tomb, whereas Luke and John say that there were 2. So I don't think there's a contradiction here. There's a compositional device involved called literary spotlighting.
Yeah, that's good. If you went to go speak at a church and you brought your wife with you, and someone said, Licona was at my church and he said this, and someone said, no, he's wrong because Licona brought his wife too. Well, it's like, well, that really wasn't relevant to the point of what the guy was trying to make, right? By saying you went to his church. And so there's a group of people, including Salome and Joanna and others and all these Marys. Sometimes they're hard to keep straight in the Bible. But this we does tip us off that there are other women who are there. And there is no contradiction because, first of all, let's just observe, there's no text that says Mary Magdalene stayed home, like she slept in or something. There's no story that says they got to the tomb and someone helped them roll the stone away and they anointed Jesus' corpse. There's no story like that. So let's just understand the details that are being highlighted and spotlighted. And of course, all historical reporting is by definition selective, right? You can't report every single detail, and that's not their point. So in every story, Jesus is not in the tomb. The women are the first witnesses, which, as you've pointed out in your many books and writings, is really highly evidential because the testimony of women was not as highly respected as the testimony of men. And I think what a beautiful thing that God actually, in his sovereignty, chose to use the voice of people who are marginalized in the community to be the first to preach the resurrection. So that's the point about the women at the tomb. Well, we are rapidly coming to the end of our time here, so I guess I will ask you, what's the biggest pushback you've gotten from atheists on this in terms of contradictions in the Bible, and then you ushering a defense of the scriptures?
From atheists?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I've gotten much pushback from
Really?
atheists on this. So, this is kind of new stuff. This is groundbreaking stuff. And like Bart Ehrman, I could say something he said. So he said he agrees with me on that. But he says that renders the Gospels as being unreliable, historically unreliable sources about Jesus. And I said, well, no, it doesn't. We use these same things today. And he said, well, we don't use all of them. And I'd say, no, we don't use all of them, but that's what they used back then. And we have to judge them according to the literary conventions in play when they wrote, rather than forcing our ideas of modern precision upon them. We don't want to be anachronistic here. And he said, this was at a panel discussion back in 2019 in Chicago, up where you're at, Mikkel. And he said, well, the kind of accuracy or reliability you're talking about is not what the average person thinks today. And I'd say, well, we can agree on that. But, here's the thing. If we're going to say the Gospels are historically unreliable because they use these compositional devices, then we also have to say that all ancient historical literature is historically unreliable because they all use it. And he said, well, that's right. They're all unreliable. And I said, well, Bart, now you've gone too far, and you're guilty of the same thing you're accusing me of. The kind of reliability standard that you have and what you call reliable, nobody in the pews are going to understand it that way. Because if you're going to say that all ancient historical literature is historically unreliable, that's going to give the impression that we can know little to nothing about the past. And that certainly is not the case. So, Bart, it is our responsibility. Look, you and I, and Mikkel, we can say this I say this of you too. We study history. We're into this stuff. This is what we do for a living. We're passionate about it. We want to know things like, how do we know the past? How well can we know the past? What kind of approach do we take to it? What criteria do we use? And how effective is this kind of stuff? And what kind of confidence, historical confidence, can we have when we're looking at this? We like to get into this kind of stuff far more than 99% of everybody else in the world likes to do it. So when we are talking about technical things like we are, it is our responsibility as historians, as scholars, to be able to explain this stuff in a manner that people can understand. And so if we have to explain what we mean by historically reliable, well, that's fine. We just need to do it.
Yeah. Well, I really like how you've brought up the idea of compositional devices and challenged us, challenged even Christians to think through carefully the ideas that we have about the scripture and to better appreciate what God has given us in the scriptures. Mike, is there anything else you want to say as we land the plane on our show today?
This is fun stuff. Love talking about it. I would say to your viewers, those viewing this, look, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity is true, period. And so no matter what you do, there's going to always be things that we can't have answers to. There's going to be things that we read in the Old Testament or New Testament that might trouble us because we don't have any answers that we could say, well, this is certainly what happened. This is the answer to our dilemma here. We can give some possible answers. They're just going to be unanswered questions, as there is in all disciplines out there. Be in all disciplines of science, there's going to be unanswered questions. But if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true. And it was written, Christianity was true because Jesus rose from the dead, and he rose probably at least 2 decades before the Gospels were even written. So how could if there are errors in the Gospels, I'm not saying there are, but if there are errors in the Gospels, how would that negate the truth of Christianity when Christianity was true before any of the Gospels were written? So don't let the little details and some of these other things, I'm not saying they're not important, but they don't overturn the truth of Christianity. So don't let these things rock your faith. Wrestle with them, yeah, but don't let them rock your faith. Focus on the main thing, which is the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, thank you, Mike, so much. You've given us some great things to think about. And I love this idea of difference not always having to mean contradiction. So thanks for helping us work through that. And thank you for being on the show.
You're welcome, my brother.
And we thank you so much for joining us here on the Apologetics Guy show today. If you liked what you heard here today, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, rate us on Spotify. And if you're watching the YouTube video, please like the video and drop a comment, and we'd love to engage with you in the comments on the video. Once again, I'm your Apologetics Guy, Dr. Mikkel, and until next time, keep the faith.